The morning sunlight poured through the tall glass windows of the five-star restaurant, scattering golden light across polished tables and half-filled champagne glasses. Conversations murmured softly among the city's elite, deal-makers, investors, and power brokers whose smiles at calculations worth millions. But at the very center table, where the world's wealth met the edge of human fragility, sat a man who suddenly looked smaller than his empire. Charles Donovan, the billionaire who owned half the Manhattan skyline, sat stiffly in his seat, a black leather notebook open before him. His fingers trembled slightly as he flipped a page, trying to hide the panic rising in his chest. Across from him sat Mr. Takahiro, a respected Japanese industrialist, a man whose handshake could seal a partnership worth hundreds of millions. But today, there was no handshake. The translator had canceled an hour earlier, leaving Charles stranded in a conversation that could not exist. No backup, no time to reschedule. Months of negotiations, preparation, and sleepless nights were slipping away with every awkward silence. Charles prided himself on control, money, markets, men, but none of that mattered when he couldn't even form a sentence the other man understood. He gestured helplessly at charts, graphs, and numbers, forcing strained smiles as he repeated words that meant nothing to man across from him. Mr. Takahiro, ever composed, watched politely. His face was unreadable, but his patience was thinning. Finally, he set his napkin down, a quiet, deadly signal in business diplomacy. The meeting was over before it began. Charles swallowed hard, feeling sweat bead at his temple. Not like this. Not after all this work. At a nearby table, a waitress named Emily glanced over as she refilled a guest glass. She wasn't supposed to notice, wasn't supposed to see. Waitresses in places like this were trained to be invisible. But Emily had never been very good at invisibility. She noticed people, the tremor in a hand, the sigh behind a smile, the quiet moments others ignored. Now she saw Charles Donovan, a man she recognized from headlines, on the verge of defeat. His body language spoke volumes, pride collapsing into helplessness. And across from him, a dignified man who clearly wanted to understand but could not. Her heart twisted, because she understood that look, the helplessness of being unheard. She'd lived it. A year ago, Emily had been sleeping in her old car, clutching her late father's Japanese-English dictionary, the same one he'd used when teaching her as a child. Her father, a linguistics professor, used to tell her, language is not just words. It's respect. It's the bridge between souls. When he died, Emily lost not just him, but her direction, her scholarship, and her faith in herself. Working here, serving people who didn't know her name, was her way of surviving. And yet, the sound of the Japanese language still echoed deep inside her, soft and warm, like an old lullaby she couldn't forget. She hesitated, watching Charles try one last time to gesture his way through a business proposal. The billionaire who had everything suddenly looked like a lost child. Then she heard him mutter under his breath, barely audible, "God, I can't do this." Something inside her stirred. Before she could talk herself out of it, she approached the table with the calm of someone who had nothing left to lose. Setting down a fresh pitcher of water, she turned to the older man and said softly, in clear, graceful Japanese, "Omate shite mason." "I'm sorry for the wait." The sound of his own language made Mr. Takahiro's eyes widen in surprise. He blinked, then smiled faintly, inclining his head. Charles froze, startled. You speak Japanese?" Emily nodded, her heart pounding. "Yes, sir. I studied it for years. I can help if you'll let me." For a moment, silence hovered between them. Then Charles's expression cracked, relief flooding his face like sunlight after a storm. "Please," he whispered. Emily took the empty seat beside him, smoothing her apron nervously. Her hands trembled, but her voice, when she spoke, carried steady respect. She began translating softly, her tone natural, her rhythm gentle. At first, it was just words, bridging sentences, explaining ideas. But soon, her translation carried meaning. She shaped his pitch not just with logic, but with heart. When Charles spoke of profits, she spoke instead of shared prosperity. When he emphasized expansion, she translated it as partnership. When he talked about innovation, she spoke of legacy. Her father's lessons guided every phrase. Don't just translate language. Translate intention. Mr. Takahiro's posture shifted. His eyes, once guarded, now softened. He asked questions, real questions, and listened. For the first time that day, laughter cracked through the tension like morning light through clouds. Charles found himself smiling again. His voice steadied. The meeting flowed, slowly, beautifully, built not by power but by trust. Plates were cleared, coffee replaced champagne, and hours disappeared in the quiet music of understanding. Emily was no longer the silent waitress in the corner. She was the bridge neither man knew they needed. For Charles, it was humbling. For Mr. Takahiro, it was moving. He spoke of how he'd started with nothing, of how trust mattered more than numbers. He said that in Japan, sincerity outweighed strategy. And as Emily translated, both men realized they weren't just negotiating a deal. They were rediscovering humanity in business. By the time dessert arrived, Charles wasn't just selling a vision. He was sharing one. When the meeting ended, Mr. Takahiro stood, adjusted his jacket, and smiled warmly at Emily. His voice was soft but deliberate as he said, in slow English, "You remind me of my daughter. Your father must be proud." Emily's breath caught, her eyes glistening. Then he turned to Charles and spoke something quietly in Japanese. Emily hesitated, translating softly, her voice trembling with disbelief. "He says he'll sign the deal. He trusts your heart." Charles sat back, stunned. For a moment, he couldn't speak. Then, in a voice that barely carried, he said, "You didn't just save the deal. You saved me." Emily smiled faintly, bowing her head. "Sometimes kindness speaks louder than words, sir." Outside, the city buzzed with evening light as Emily changed out her uniform, ready to head home. She didn't know that Charles Donovan was waiting just beyond the door, standing beneath the glittering skyline his company had built. When she stepped out, he approached quietly, no longer the man who commanded boardrooms. He was simply grateful. "I wanted to give you something," he said, handing her a sealed envelope. Inside was a check, an amount so large it made her breath catch, and a small handwritten note that read, "For the bridge you built when I had none." Emily's eyes welled up. Then, gently, she handed it back. "Sir," she said softly, "you already gave me what I needed, belief." Charles stood speechless, the folded check still in his hand as Emily disappeared down the wet pavement, her figure illuminated by the glow of passing headlights. For years, he had bought loyalty, trust, even affection. But that night, for the first time, he had witnessed something money could never purchase. When he returned home, he placed the envelope on his desk beside his stack of contracts and investment reports. Yet all night, his thoughts returned to that young woman with gentle eyes and quiet courage. She hadn't just translated words. She had translated integrity, humanity, everything his corporate life had forgotten. By morning, Charles had made a decision. He called his board secretary and said, "Find out everything you can about that waitress. Emily, I want her on my team." The secretary hesitated. "As an interpreter, sir?" Charles smiled faintly. "No, as something far more valuable." 2 weeks later, Emily was wiping down a table when the restaurant manager approached her, his expression unreadable. "Emily, there's someone here to see you," he said, gesturing toward the entrance. She turned and froze. There stood Charles Donovan, impeccably dressed yet softer somehow, like a man who had traded arrogance for gratitude. In his hand, he held a slim briefcase. "Miss Emily," he greeted warmly, "I hope I'm not interrupting your shift." "Mr. Donovan," she stammered, I didn't expect." He smiled. "I didn't expect you either that day. But you changed everything. I'd like to return the favor." He handed her a crisp envelope, not a check this time, but an official offer letter bearing his company's logo. Emily's eyes widened as she read. It wasn't for a temporary position or translation work. It was an entry-level role on his international relations team, with full training, mentorship, and benefits. Charles said quietly, "I don't just need translators, Emily. I need bridge builders. You show me what that really means." Tears welled in her eyes. "Sir, I don't know if I'm qualified." You are, he interrupted gently. You've already done more than most of my executives ever have. You reminded me that understanding isn't about language, it's about listening. Within months, Emily's life transformed. She moved out of her small shared apartment into a modest studio overlooking Central Park. For the first time in years, she didn't wake up wondering how she'd afford rent or groceries. Her days filled with work she loved, building cultural programs, coordinating overseas conferences, and helping companies from Tokyo to Toronto connect through empathy and understanding. She traveled, learned, and grew, slowly shedding the self-doubt that had once bound her. At company events, Charles often introduced her not as an employee, but as the woman who saved a billion-dollar partnership with kindness. But Emily never sought attention. For her, the real reward came one quiet afternoon in Tokyo. She was helping organize a corporate summit when an elderly man approached her, bowing deeply. It was Mr. Takahiro. He recognized her instantly, his face lighting up. Miss Emily, he said warmly. I told Charles-san you are his Kokoro no Tsuyaku. She tilted her head. Heart translator? She guessed, smiling. He nodded. Yes, you translate hearts, not just words. They shared tea that afternoon, and he told her something that would stay with her forever. When people speak only for profit, no one listens. But when someone speaks with kindness, even silence understands. Back in New York, the story quietly spread across the corporate world. A waitress had rescued a billionaire from failure, not with money, but with compassion. News outlets called it the $100 million translation. But those who knew the truth said it wasn't about a contract. It was about connection. Charles's company evolved after that. He launched a global initiative called the Bridge Project, designed to foster cultural exchange between startups in different countries. Emily helped design its core programs, language mentorships, empathy-driven leadership workshops, and youth exchange scholarships named after her late father, Professor Ayers. She often visited schools and community centers, sharing her story, not as a tale of luck, but of courage. You never know who's watching, she'd tell students. Sometimes the world changes because one person dares to speak when everyone else stays silent. Years passed. Emily rose through the company ranks, not through ambition, but through quiet excellence. She became director of global partnerships by the time she was 30, overseeing projects across Asia and Europe. And yet, she never lost her humility. She still carried her father's worn-out dictionary in her bag, its corners frayed, its cover nearly torn. On difficult days, she'd open it to the first page, where her father had once written, "To my daughter, may you always listen with your heart first." Every time she read it, she remembered that morning in the restaurant, the trembling billionaire, the patient Japanese investor, and her own heartbeat pounding in her chest as courage overcame fear. One spring afternoon, years later, a journalist interviewed Mr. Takahiro for a feature on global business ethics. When asked why he had chosen to trust Charles Donovan's company over dozens of other candidates, he smiled and said, "Because one waitress showed me the soul of their business." That single quote became legendary, printed in magazines and corporate leadership books. But for Emily, it wasn't fame she felt. It was quiet fulfillment. She often thought her father's favorite saying, "Understanding builds empires stronger than money ever could." And she knew he had been right. One evening, as she left her office, Charles found her standing by the window overlooking the glowing skyline. "You know," he said softly, "every time I see the city lights, I think of that day, the day you reminded me what all this is supposed to mean." Emily smiled faintly. "You built half the skyline, sir." He chuckled. "Maybe, but you built something better, a bridge." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the city pulse with life below. Finally, Charles said, "Do you ever regret stepping in that day?" She shook her head. "No, I think it was the moment my life finally spoke back." The following year, Kindness Thread, a storytelling platform, featured her journey in a short film titled The Waitress Who Translated a Billionaire's Heart. It went viral, not for glamour, but for authenticity. People across the world shared it, saying it restored their faith in empathy. At the film's end, Emily's voice narrated over footage of the restaurant's sunlight-dappled tables. Sometimes, life gives you one small moment of choice. You can stay silent or you can speak. And when you speak with kindness, you might just change the world. If this story touched your heart, remember, kindness and courage don't always roar. Sometimes they whisper. So take a moment to reflect. Yellowheart, who will you choose to understand today? Yellowheart, whose silence will you break with compassion? Because like Emily, you might discover that the smallest act of empathy can rewrite the biggest chapters of someone's life. If this story inspired you, please like, share, and subscribe to HOA Gride.